You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and we're glad you tuned in. I'd like to remind you of the value of leaving reviews on places like iTunes or wherever you're listening, as well as the value of sharing us with your various networks. It's a real pleasure for me to host most of the TeachThought podcast episodes and get to bring you thoughtful and interesting guests. And as our audience grows, so does the quality and the quantity of guests that are available to us. So we do encourage you and would appreciate any of those reviews, shares, and things like that to help us grow our audience. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to me via email at drew@teachthought.com. If you have stumbled upon us but are not familiar with our work in other areas, just a few notes that we do directly work with schools, leaders, and teachers to help them grow to better prepare learners for what we call the modern world by building upon the ethos of TeachThought.com. So I invite you to visit our professional development website, wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find information on the variety of workshops, consulting services, and events that we offer to help you grow in areas like project-based learning and inquiry, differentiated instruction, assessment, literacy, growth mindset, leadership, and much more. So I invite you again to contact us today to explore how we can help design and deliver professional learning that provokes profound thinking driven by your beautiful questions. In today's podcast, I spoke with Barb Oakley, who is an engineering professor at Oakland University and the author of a new book on learning called Learning How to Learn, as well as being one of the architects behind one of the largest MOOCs from Coursera on learning how to learn. A really fascinating conversation. I came across her opinion article in the New York Times from August 7th this year, called Make Your Daughter Practice Math. She'll thank you later. And I want to talk with her because I think we have some differences in how we approach teaching and learning. And we had a really interesting conversation exploring those differences and some of the overlaps and how she really thinks about focusing on STEM teaching, the role of constructivist learning and what that really means versus direct instruction and what that really means, how that might play out differently for different cognitive abilities, as well as balances of sort of Eastern and Western philosophies and approaches to learning. So really thoughtful conversation. Again, we didn't agree on everything, which is part of the reason I wanted to have that conversation, but I hope you enjoy the podcast and find it useful. Welcome to the podcast, Barb. I'm happy to have you with me. Her name is Barb Oakley, and I'm going to give her, as I often do, an opportunity to introduce herself and give our listeners a little bit more background from her perspective and how she got to the place where she currently is.
Oh, well, I'm a professor of engineering at Oakland University in Michigan, and I came at the engineering profession in a roundabout way. I was terrible at math and science growing up, so I flunked my way through K-12 math and science, and only when I was 26 years old did I begin to start with remedial high school algebra, and began climbing my way slowly up and retraining my brain so that I actually could learn in math and science. And my original background is I enlisted in the Army right out of high school and learned Russian. And what I found was that many of the ideas in language learning that I learned while I was at the Defense Language Institute, which is one of the world's leading language instruction facilities, many of these ideas are very applicable from language, are applicable in learning in math in particular, math and science. And now that I, have worked my way up and have a good background in sort of what is going on in neuroscience and in cognitive psychology, I can see that the reason that I was later able to be successful in math and science studies, even though I was much older, was that the fundamental ways that we learn language are actually quite applicable to learning in math and science. And when I applied those techniques, lo and behold, it was not easy, but it made being successful in these very different disciplines a possibility for me. And so now what I try to do in my work is to open doors to others to be successful in STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics disciplines. And so that's a focus of my work. I teach with Terence Sanowski, the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute, a massive open online course called Learning How to Learn, which is one of the world's most popular massive open online courses. We're starting to close in on 2.5 million students thus far. So ideas from neuroscience and from cognitive psychology about how we learn effectively can really be valuable for people, and they can actually enjoy learning about them.
Interesting. So one of the things that came across my radar that grabbed my attention was a recent New York Times article, or I guess opinion article, entitled "Make Your Daughter Practice Math. She'll Thank You Later." And in that article, you kind of dive into the way that we teach math, and in particular, why it might hurt girls the most. And I'm really interested in this conversation. For that, I have two daughters, as podcast listeners probably have recognized, as I talk about them probably way too much, and embarrassingly so. But as I think about that with teaching and learning and the work that we do, and quite honestly, it's interesting to me to have this conversation because I'm curious to explore the differences and intersections in the ways that you and I think about learning, because some of the things that you are proposing or sort of pushing are some of the rote memorization pieces that we tend to shy away from in a constructivist learning environment. So I'm curious to have this conversation because of that. But if you would kind of take us through your thinking when well, let's first start with STEM and math principles. Like, why, there's a big push for that from a certain group of people. Is there a particular reason that you feel like STEM is maybe more important than any of the other disciplines, if in fact you do?
Oh, I can't help but think that STEM is particularly important in this day and age. We know that language and culture are always going to be important, but it's just that nowadays, if you really want to have all career doors open for you, having a good background in STEM is going to be invaluable. It just means you've got the whole world of careers to choose from. If you are not capable in STEM, you have a much restricted skill set that you can use when you go out into the work world. So for me, when I was growing up, I did just what they said. I followed my passion, which was I wanted to learn a new language. And so I did. I learned a new language in the military. They taught me Russian. I ended up working out on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea, and still, when I have a little bit to drink, that Russian comes right back. But the thing is, what I found was that by doing what everybody said to just follow my passion, I had put myself in a career box. I mean, in some sense, it is actually being very selfish. It's like, I just want to study what I want, what I feel like I'm good at, without looking around at the world and saying, what does the world need? How can I also fit fit what I'm doing into what's going on in the world. And everyone has vested interests in wanting to promote their own disciplines, as far as what they want to encourage youngsters to go into. But the reality is that nowadays there's a tremendous need for people, even if they don't specialize in something with STEM, that they at least have some comfort with what's going on, that they're not afraid of the analytics. So I think that's part of, we often make the mistake of thinking, well, you can just go look it up. So why learn the multiplication tables? Well, that's a lot like saying, you want to learn French? Well, you can always just go look it up on Google Translate. So why bother to memorize any vocabulary or practice with any of the grammatical structures? I mean, you have to practice and use, and as well as understand what you are learning if you want to master any subject. So Anders Ericsson, for example, who's an expert, who has studied experts of all sorts, says the one common factor of all experts is that they have created solid structures in long-term memory, sets of links that they can easily access, so they don't have to pull things in their limited working memory. They don't have to figure things out there. They've already kind of figured things out and put a subroutine into long-term memory. And that only happens when you have practiced and developed procedural fluency with whatever topic you are starting to learn. So constructivism, I think, is a superb approach. At the same time, you can't. The higher you go in mathematics, the more difficult it becomes for an individual to construct things on their own, and the more time-consuming. So there's copious research evidence that the higher you go, the more problematic constructivism can be, despite the, it just sounds like a very positive sort of thing. And indeed, we need to actively construct our own learning. But a good teacher can be invaluable in helping expedite an individual. For example, one of my great heroes in sports is a fellow by the name of Julius Yago. And Julius wanted to become a javelin thrower, and he was from Kenya, and there were no javelin throwing coaches in all of Kenya. So he just went to YouTube, found master instructors, and taught himself how to throw the javelin by watching these great videos and then going out and practicing. And between all of that, he actually became the world champion javelin thrower. And you must ask yourself, could he have become the world champion javelin thrower if it had been a constructivist approach, where he couldn't watch someone showing him what does he really need to be careful of and to do? He could not have done it. So there's a place for constructivism, but there's plenty of evidence that for really smart kids, constructivist and student-centered approaches are marvelous. And for kids who don't have a really good working memory, which gives them other advantages, but they're often considered the not as quick learners. For those individuals, it can be, research has shown it can be superbly helpful to be guided through some of these initial ideas. That constructivist approach, especially for someone who doesn't have a good working memory, you're just actually asking too much cognitively.
Interesting. Now, I would perhaps define constructivist less narrowly, maybe, in so far as that, the way that you describe that javelin thrower and the way that he learned how to become a world champion as essentially a constructivist approach that he figured out and constructed and made that meaning and figured much of that out on his own. And I find that there's a constructivist, a myth around constructivists, and when we do workshops, and one of my favorite jokes is that we do a lot of work in project-based learning, for example, and inquiry-based learning, and we're not looking at free-range chicken. This is not just giving kids free range to wander about and make meaning of everything, that there is a role that the teacher plays. It's a facilitation role and some direction and thinking about the questions that need to be pursued and want to be pursued. And there's sort of a spectrum of how we might design that, in that there's more or less autonomy. Ideally, there's sort of much less autonomy, but there's lots of cases where there needs to be, more autonomy, but in many cases there needs to be less autonomy because, as you mentioned, some of the teacher-directed, teacherly authority pieces of helping to facilitate for that learning is necessary. That thinking about and focusing the learning through the questions that they're trying to answer is where that teacher role comes in.
I think so. I think that when you really get at great teaching, whether you are coming at it from you're a constructivist or whether you come at it from you're more of a traditionalist, I think really great teaching actually meets in the middle. So some can kind of tend to say, well, constructivist approaches aren't really as helpful, but in some sense what's happening is a bit of a straw man, characterization of constructivism that doesn't include the very real instruction, direct instruction that's taking place. And likewise, when some will say, you've got this rote learning, it's drill and kill. Well, there is some of that, but a great teacher uses that to simply balance some of the other more exciting things that they're also doing. So I think that great instruction is actually, a melding in the middle of, some practice, some repetition. You're teaching guitar, it can't all be air guitar. You've got to have a little bit of plug and chug, and you're really practicing. That is not always fun. But at the same time, a great teacher is also very motivational and helps provide a framework that allows the student to structure and thus construct their own learning. It
is that exactly, in my mind, that meeting students where they are and finding that sort of line between the complexity of the work that they're engaging in cognitively and the amount of guidance and help that a teacher might do. And I agree with you that about the straw man sort of idea there, that the thinking that there is no direct instruction in project-based learning or constructivist inquiry-based learning is an absolute falsehood, but again, a myth or a straw man. And there should be a role for a teacher. And so when we think about that, we think about it as moving from a push dynamic to a pull dynamic. And instead of the teacher pushing out, here's what you need to know, sit down, I want you to listen to this, I want you to pay attention, practice this, so on and so forth, that's the dominant approach to a pull, where they're helping the students uncover content and what they need to know and learn, and perhaps do some drill on or some direct instruction or perhaps memorization kinds of pieces as part of meeting an open-ended challenge. So you're sort of pulling with with questions. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. I think relevant to this, I should bring out my own experiences. I mean, for example, in that New York Times op-ed, the point I was making there was that, now this is a subtle argument, but once you grab it, it's very simple. And that is, we know that by and large, boys and girls are pretty much the same in their abilities to master mathematics. However, there are developmental differences in little boys and little girls' abilities to master the language arts. And it appears that little girls, on average, are ahead in their verbal abilities. This is early on. Things average out later on, but early on is when you start to form your self-conceptions of what you're good at, and what you're good at is what you form your self-conceptions about what your passions are, what you want to do. And so what this ultimately means is that, put little boys aside. Just look at a little girl. On average, within herself, she is going to be better verbally than she is at math, even though her math skills are just as good as a little boy's, on average. And for little boys, on the other hand, a little boy would look within himself and say, my math skills are better than my verbal skills, just looking within himself. And that, again, is on average, even though boys and girls have the same math ability. So what this really means is that little girls are, when we tell them, follow your passion, well, that always means kind of, what are you good at? What do you like? What comes easy for you? That's often what that equates to. And for them, it's often verbal things, because they're just better verbally because of these developmental advantages that they accrue by virtue of a number of different processes that occur during maturation, the early maturation process. And so how can we help little girls? What they're doing in essence is saying, wow, I'm really good verbally, and hey, this math stuff's harder, because it is for them, than their verbal stuff. The best way to help a little girl to kind of even out those two areas is to actually give them some extra practice with math. So this is what we did with our own two daughters. I will, let's see, how can I put this? Our older daughter was not a math maven as a child. Math did not come easy for her. Everything needed extra explanation. She just wasn't very good at it. But we put both of our daughters in Kumon Mathematics, which is like an extra 20 minutes of practice and procedural fluency and mastery learning. We started at about age 3. So it was about 10 years there of a little bit of extra math practice. And here's this little girl who really would have been one of those ones that grew up and said, I just don't have the math gene. She's now finishing her medical residency at Stanford. So just that little bit of extra practice made an enormous difference for her in gaining a sense of mastery, and that she could really do it, and in building those solid neural structures. It's like if you had an extra 20 minutes a day of practicing French, you would be better over the years. So that's how it worked for us.
Well, as I think about the role and some of the challenges of teachers, and it becomes more pronounced as you go from elementary to middle to high school, fighting that compliance battle. So getting students to do something like that, I have I have two daughters, 9 and 11, and there are some things that they love to do and will do. Matter of fact, I have to stop them from doing because it's, taking away from other things. And then there are some things that they don't like to do. And I certainly am not proposing that we don't have, again, some of that authority and parental guidance and saying, well, you are going to clean your room. I know you don't like cleaning your room, but you are going to take a shower. You are going to brush your teeth, even though it's no fun. But there is that compliance battle that teachers get into with students that sometimes. So I'm wondering. I do see the value of when you're saying, okay, so doing some practice on something like math to gain some proficiency, to get to a point where, this is perhaps something, or at least connected to something that I do enjoy, and the lack of proficiency isn't a stumbling block for me to do it well enough to enjoy it. So I see the value in that, but I also wonder how to balance that with teachers, especially at the middle and then high school level, where oftentimes you have students who don't want to do it and are angry that you're sort of asking them to do it and push them on those kinds of things. So any advice or thoughts on that?
Well, my advice is more from a parental perspective, and that relates to simply, should you or should you not be a tiger mom? And, the tiger mom is someone who's going to be, oh, man, you got to have dance, you got to have play a musical instrument, you got to practice this, in addition, and you've also got to be excellent at everything you're doing in school. And I'm a very laid-back person, so I don't like to boss people around, tell them what to do. If I have a lot of pushback from someone, I don't like to, fight those battles. But I figured I do know what's going on in the greater world. And of all the things that are out there, the one thing that is going to open all career doors for my kids is if they are able to master math. All of STEM opens up, and in fact, a whole world opens up if they know math. And so I introduced them when they were young to, they had basketball camp and dance and mandolin lessons and all this kind of stuff.
Sure.
And none of it really took. But the one thing that I got to mandate that they did, whether or not they liked it, was that 20 minutes of extra math a day. So I just mandated it, and since it was my one battle, that was the one battle I chose, and it pretty much worked pretty well. And what makes me laugh is that nowadays our girls are kind of like, well, why didn't you pick one more battle? How come you didn't teach us a musical instrument? But it is difficult. I think this is where Asian parents they have such, oftentimes, a real respect for learning and what learning can do. And so Asian parents, growing from the culture, are able to be great compliments for what the teacher is doing at school because they're reinforcing this idea that practice is important. And I wish more American parents would also kind of appreciate that importance and value of working hand in hand with teachers, because that could help make teachers' jobs easier, in that when you that practice isn't always easy and isn't always fun, but especially if the kid is just a normal kid and they're not, super gifted at that particular topic, that practice is invaluable for them. And so the more you can encourage it bit by bit every day, whether it's coming from the teacher or the parents, the more that child will ultimately benefit. Sometimes I'm just shocked because you'll hear cognitive scientists from the U.S. saying, well, the child is just not ready for that level of math. And they're completely ignoring the fact that Chinese students will come to the U.S. and laugh at how behind we are in how we teach math, in what our students are capable of doing. And it's simply because we have such low expectations and provide for so little practice and construction internally of procedural fluency that allows for expertise in math to really flower.
That is fascinating. I'm wondering when you mentioned sort of the culture of Asian parents and the sort of Singapore math and those kinds of things that I'm somewhat familiar with. I'm not a math in particular person, but I'm wondering if it's a culture of, because you call it sort of a culture of learning, or referred to it in those terms. And again, correct me if I'm misstating what you're thinking here, but I wonder if what the difference is between that sort of culture of learning and a culture of thinking. And I certainly think that there's something to be said for increasing the respect for learning in classroom and school and thinking about that. But I do think there's a danger in replicating too much of that Asian culture mindset, at least stereotypically, that gets towards the compliance game and shifts away from what I see as deeper learning or thinking that perhaps gets as an opportunity cost there. Does that make any sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're bringing up a very important point. There's a wonderful book called Little Soldiers by Lenore Chu, and it was about having her child in a very, very good K-5 school within Shanghai, and the sort of the pluses and the minuses of that system. And to my mind, the optimal learning approach is a melding of Eastern and Western approaches. I think the Chinese approach, for example, to teaching mathematics is quite a good one, and if balanced by some of the sort of a little bit open problem type approaches and metaphorical approaches of Western approaches, it could be absolutely ideal. But even so, when you're learning mathematics, what you really need is you need to have a solid foundation of the basics. And that needs to be a structure within your long-term memory that you can draw on. And that can help you be creative with what you're learning. So you can use those thinking skills and think more creatively when you have the solid structures. I remember speaking with an educator once here in the U.S., and she said, "Isn't it crazy? We spend 95% of the time on all of these sort of low-level things, and then only 5% on the pinnacle, the creative thinking, that sort of thing. It's just crazy. It should be the other way around." And I just looked at her and I thought, that's like saying to speak a language, you should spend all your time speaking the language even though you don't know the vocabulary, you don't know the structure, and you don't know anything about it because we haven't put the time in to do that. But we want you to think creatively about this language. it just doesn't work that way. You have to have those fundamentals solidly in place. And for us, for Westerners, there's often this, there's a sense of if we just make math more exciting, we'll get all these people to come on board. And yet what that's actually doing is it is reducing kids' ability to have those neural structures in place, the foundational elements that they need to be creative in what they're learning. And so then when they get to higher levels, the foundations aren't there, and it's much, much more difficult for them. I mean, if you look, I would say 80% or more of my colleagues in engineering come from countries that have this rote approach to learning that we stigmatize as a complete anathema, and yet it helped them to be successful and to become my colleagues. And so why are we shortchanging kids who go through the American system and making it more difficult for them because we're not giving them that solid foundation that other children around the world who are very successful do get? To me, sometimes it's just, I think we can do so much better.
So what's the, if I give you a sort of a scenario of project-based learning where we might pull some of that work that gets towards building those foundational skills, because this is one of the things that I have conversation with folks sometimes, especially who push back against sort of project-based learning. And I think that it's sort of the melding of the two Eastern and Western philosophies, if you will. So in my daughter's 5th grade class last year, I helped in their class. They needed to learn, the teacher wanted them to learn and think through and understand multiplication of decimals among some other math concepts. So what we did was to create a tipping guide for a local restaurant. And one of the things that people sometimes say is, well, you can't think about nothing, right? You can't, like, you sort of referenced it a little bit, you can't be creative without having something to be creative with. You have to have some content fluency and understanding, which I definitely agree with. But shifting away from teaching those things as a front load and then going to apply them, sort of working up Bloom's taxonomy, and instead starting at the top of Bloom's taxonomy and asking them to create, and in this case, a tipping guide, and with the teacher's help identifying some of those things that they need to know and need to learn, and among those, in this case, multiplication of decimals. So then it becomes one of it's a pool thing. So, we need to know how to effectively multiply decimals, which would bring in some of those practice pieces. Does that jive with your thinking as how you might meld those two Eastern and Western philosophies?
Absolutely, if it is also done in conjunction with, once the students see the motivation, they practice with the techniques so they can do them really quickly. Mm-hmm. And when you can do that, then, I mean, it's a bit like backing up a car. If we ask someone to explain, what do you do when you back up a car? You don't really understand how to back up a car until you can explain it to me. Well, that's kind of silly. I mean, actually backing up a car is really, really tough until you learn and practice and do it. And then it's totally easy. All you have to do is reach into working memory, and you've got that sort of subroutine for, this is how I back up a car. So this is also what you want to do when you're calculating tips. You want to have some kind of procedural fluency. So, tip, I just do this, and then boom, you can calculate it. Instead of, now, how did we do that again? I know there was a reason why. Now, what was the structure? There's a very different, getting the motivation is a good thing, And getting the understanding is a good thing, but being able to just do it really quickly in your head, that is the be-all and end-all. That is the ultimate melding of that Eastern and Western approach to learning.
Well, that would be the fluent part. So you want them to be fluent in the content, and that to me implies that they are able to do it and there are certain pieces of content and skills that I think are really, math being one of those. Like, you don't want to have to go through the process of figuring out the math every time. You want to be able to have that on hand, as you mentioned, right? That does help with the other pieces. So that fluency is a part of that, and we want to make that a part of the learning and the structure and the architecture of the project, in this case of creating a tipping guide. So not only do we need to know how to do it, but we need to know how to do it quickly and well, because we want to be able to talk about it. And that's one of the things that I think one of the sort of misunderstandings, or the idea that we are going to have students leave our courses and classes as content area experts, knowing all of the content in a class, is, while perhaps a wonderful ideal, I think it's fairly unattainable. I don't know any teacher who has had a student leave with all of the content of that subject area. Matter of fact, most teachers don't have a mastery of all areas of the content in any given course. But perhaps more realistic and a better goal, and you may push back on this, and I'd welcome you to, is to be able to think like content area experts. So to think like an engineer, to think like a mathematician, especially, we certainly want an engineer to have mastery and be highly fluent in engineering concepts and the math and the science behind it. But in a K-12 setting, they're not engineers yet. We want them replicating and thinking like content area experts, in this case an engineer or a social scientist or historian. So I'm curious, that distinction between content area expert and being able to think like a content area expert, your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, being an excellent engineer is something that can take years of practice as a professional engineer to actually acquire. I think that one of the, so we're always just working forwards to exhibit more and more mastery in different subjects, and then when we become professionals, say a professional in business administration or in engineering or in medicine, what we're often doing is we're drawing on all these small sub pieces of expertise that we've gradually been building. I think one thing, though, that we often forget is we think that understanding is different than fluency, and it's actually not. Research has shown in what's going on in your prefrontal cortex that the more you practice, the more it helps enhance your understanding. So the two they're one and, the flip sides of the same coin. And I remember one time I was teaching at a disadvantaged school district, and the teachers were telling me, we just don't understand why there's this emphasis on being really fast to answer math questions or anything like that. Well, if they just eventually figure it out, that's all that matters. And I was so shocked, because that gets to the heart of what you were just talking about. Should people strive to think like an engineer? Or if you are an engineer, you don't have 25 years to sit there and design a bridge. You have to be able to pull concepts to mind quickly. And in fact, it's not just engineers. It's anyone working with any type of analytical skill. And so you want to have that procedural fluency. If you're struggling and trying to put things together in your prefrontal cortex because you have not created solid long-term links in your long-term memory, if you're doing that with the basic stuff, you're just not even going to be able to go even to more advanced sorts of things. So this is why this development of procedural fluency, which is actually part and parcel of a solid understanding, they go hand in hand with one another. And I wish they weren't divorced so much in the way that they're often presented and ostensibly tested on.
Yeah, so I guess I'm still struggling with I can envision going back to a basic like math multiplication, and I certainly, like I said, I definitely agree that an engineer or, I don't want my doctor who might be operating on me to have to take 25 minutes or whatever that amount of time might be to reconfigure some of the meaning of what they're doing, right? They need to be fluent in that moment. Again, getting back to that K-12 scenario, though, I can imagine a student memorizing the multiplication tables without necessarily creating a deeper understanding of it. And so I'm wondering how closely tied those are. I don't doubt that there's more understanding, but I just wonder about how we might get more connection to that understanding other than just rote memorization.
Well, I think some visualization and manipulatives and so forth is helpful, but I think sometimes we underestimate what is going on in a student's brain when they memorize something. So, for example, poets will often tell us, memorize the poem, and you will understand it more deeply. Because you're putting the words together, you're recalling them, and as you're recalling them, you're beginning to contrast them, even if subconsciously, and you do understand it more deeply when you memorize it. It is the same even for multiplication tables. When you are rote memorizing, your mind is still beginning to create patterns. Oh, wait a minute, 2 times 3, 2 times 4, and I think what happens is, no, people only construct their understanding if they understand it exactly the way I tell them it must be understood. And there's a lot that goes on. And again, for my colleagues from countries where rote memorization is part and parcel of what you do, these individuals have a profound understanding of mathematics, partly growing from the fact that they've had to internalize sometimes through rote learning, some of the key concepts. And as you may learn the multiplication table through rote, but then you got it in your mind, and as you begin working, problems of various sorts, that clarifies the pattern even more. There's a technique in Japan called flash anzan, where they teach little kids, like 7, 8 years old, and these kids start with an abacus, and they add numbers with the abacus. And then they take away the abacus, and the kids will drum on the table. And then they just say, no more drumming. Put your hands on your lap. And so they learn to do it more and more quickly just in their mind. And then after they're done, these kids can take 10 4-digit numbers, so like 1,279, 3,746, 10 of them can flash on a screen in 2 seconds, and these kids can just add it right up. They've got it, and we can actually see they use visual centers of their brain to do the addition, which is fascinating. But you would say, these kids just have a rote understanding. They've just practiced it so many times. But you can't tell me these kids don't really understand what addition is and how to do it and how to do it really, really quickly, because they do. And it builds a solid structure for what they're going to be doing in the future.
It sounds to me like it's not just the rote memorization, that it's also connecting it in other ways, which is what helps you deepen the understanding. And that perhaps is what I'm getting at as one of the things that we sometimes, or at least the perception of some folks who are teaching math and other things, that we want to make sure that it's not just rote memorization, that it is other things. And we talk about that with lecture, for example, that the idea of lecture being bad is only as bad as you are focusing on that as one thing and you're just transmitting. If you're not helping them by checking for understanding and also connecting to other things, that you're just missing out on multiple opportunities for deepening the learning. So I think that's an important piece. I want to circle back. I know we don't have much time left, but I want to circle back to one thing that you mentioned earlier that I wonder about, is that you sort of mentioned the constructivist learning approach might be better for those of maybe higher cognitive processing speed or something like that. I don't know exactly how you stated that, and I'll give you the opportunity to clarify that. But I'm wondering what that means and why that might be true.
Well, researcher Paul Morgan and his colleagues did a very careful analysis of some 16,000 first grade students and 600 and some teachers to see what kinds of approaches work best in the classroom when teaching math. And what they did was they divided things up into either teacher-centered or more student-centered. And he carefully defines what he means by these sorts of activities. So teacher-centered is more direct instruction, and student-centered are more like manipulative, dance, kind of personally constructed more. And what he found was that if the students were already good at math, that the student-directed activities and approaches worked very well. However, if the students were not good, they had mathematical difficulties, the more they had troubles in mathematics, the more they excelled under the teacher-directed approach that also allowed for plenty of practice. Now, why is this? There was a little bit of sort of, perhaps it's simply that kids who have troubles with math can very much benefit if you just get directly to the point and then they're able to practice with that. Kids who don't have troubles with math, they can kind of figure things out more easily on their own, and they can still do just fine with a variety of approaches to math learning. So in some sense, what Morgan's research is showing is that there's so much of a desire to encourage students in STEM topics that we're really encouraged to use really fun approaches to allow students to excel. But actually, these approaches work really well for the good students, and they do a disservice to those who are the ones we most want to be reaching and most want to be helping.
It's so to me, it's a big issue of differentiation, and sometimes when we talk about groups and grouping inside of projects, for example, the idea that we might inside of a project sort of ability group so that we can give some more direct instruction to a group, whether it's reading or math or whatever. But that the danger there, of course, is that we're relying on that, and that's the only grouping that we do that sort of gets into a tracking piece, which which if we recognize that learning happens in lots of different ways with kids, that they learn in different ways, and that academics is not the only thing that is an outcome, that I think that's where we want to think about how we might do some ability grouping, and then perhaps some other types of grouping as well. So, well,
as we're wrapping up, I just have to say, I would have been one of those kids who did not have good ability, and I would have been put in a group that would have needed more direct instruction. Mm-hmm. Now, see, keep in mind, the SMART group also does just as well with direct instruction and practice. So, you're not disenfranchising them by giving them direct instruction and practice. But I would have been one of those ones that was, she's not that great at it. I would have been slaughtered off on the side. And essentially, that's what I did to myself as an adult when I went to remedial high school algebra as a 26-year-old and began to try and learn in math and science. And I used those same sort of direct instruction along with a lot of practice that I had used when I was learning a language in the military, and it worked beautifully. And I'm now not only a professor of engineering, but I'm actually a fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. So these types of instruction, you may not be a natural, but they work no matter what, even for the type of putty that I was in teachers' hands these many years ago.
Yeah, well, again, as you mentioned, we need to wrap up here. I do think it's worth mentioning that, and I would agree that the more advanced or better at math students, we wouldn't be disenfranchising them necessarily by giving them direct instruction, but there might be an opportunity cost in the other things that they might not be able, because you do sacrifice some things, I think, with direct instruction, some other skills and abilities and things. So I do think that's worth mentioning. But Barb, I've really enjoyed this conversation. There's so many other things we could dive into, but I want to give you an opportunity, if you have any social media links. I know you've got your Coursera course, any other things that you want to share with listeners to find you and check out.
Oh, okay. Well, my latest book is just out, and it's called Learning How to Learn with Terence Sanowski, who's the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute, and it's got great practical insights for kids and for teachers and for parents about how to learn effectively. And if you're interested in just knowing what we're knowing from science about how we learn and how to practically apply that in your everyday life, I think that's a great book to pick up. And it's actually just been a privilege to share, Drew. I just thank you so much for having me on your show. Great.
Well, it's, again, a really fascinating discussion, and I appreciate the conversation. Any social media or website links or anything?
Just go to my website at barbaraoakley.com, and I also send an email out each Friday about learning called the Cheery Friday email. It goes out to almost 1.5 million students now, and to get that, just go to the Learning How to Learn course on Coursera, which is free, and sign up, and then you'll get it weekly.
Great. Okay, well, I appreciate it, and hopefully our listeners found it helpful as well.
Okay.
All right. That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.